Sure you weren't talking to anyone, Sayer? Sounded like you were having a full-blown conversation.
Yeah, you wouldn't be lying to us now, Sayer, would you?
Gentlemen, who could I possibly be conversing with? Where would I hide them? There's barely enough room in this shack for me, and now that you're here, there's hardly enough room to breathe.
So if you wanted to make a film with AI right now, and I mean a real narrative-driven film with characters, dialogue, motion, consistent sets, lighting, camera moves, a film, what exactly would that take? Is it even possible with today's technology and open source tools? Well, in this video I'm going to show you. We'll go over all these shots and exactly how I made them and put them together, but it's not for the faint of heart. AI is a promising tool, but it's also a frustrating one right now because it can't really do proper video. Yeah, at least not yet. Or can it? Because it's all already starting to change. Even while making this video, new tools have been coming out. Yeah, MagicAnimate released out of nowhere. We'll talk about it, the pros and cons. AnimateAnyone might soon be sailing its ship in the harbor, maybe. And these things didn't exist when I started making this video, but they do, or almost do now, and that's just how fast this technology is evolving. We'll also get into DreamBooth, Stable Diffusion, Control Nets, Panohead, AnimateDiff, Frame Interpolation, Thin Plate, EbSynth, TokenFlow, ComfyUi, Video Stable Diffusion, Runway ML, and about a million other things that'll probably be obsolete by the time you finish watching this video. I spent a lot of time developing a system of animation with current AI tools, and it's already dead, outdated, and useless. Or is it? Thought a lot about what I wanted to say in this video, what might still be useful to people 6 months, a year, even a decade from now, but then I realized, even as this AI technology advances daily, a lot of what I want to go over should still remain useful for a long time to come. My hope is that after watching this video, you'll not only understand a lot of these AI tools, but you'll also have some kind of knowledge of the filmmaking process itself. I decided to go this route for a couple of reasons. The first reason: there'll come a day when this technology will be accessible enough to where your average person, even your pole-licking flicks of the world, will be able to use it without expending too much time, energy, effort, or brain cells. Right now you need a decent GPU, a desktop computer, maybe some rudimentary Python scripting knowledge, or at least be willing to play Python library bingo, but all that will go away over time. Just like how DOS prompts turned into windows that turned into icons you mash with your thumb in order to get your daily trip of social media addict juice, so too will go the way of AI technology. It'll get incorporated into filters, apps, and whatever 13-year-olds inevitably decide to replace TikTok with, and when that happens, what will we be left with? We'll be left with knowing how to put a film together and tell a good story. The tools will get more accessible, more people will use them, but so many of those people probably won't know anything about filmmaking, will ignore that entire aspect of it and leapfrog headfirst into the technology. You see this with technology all the time. People using it and adopting it before they understand its true purpose and value. I mean, that's pretty much the whole story of social media, right? For decades, Hollywood has been enamored with visual effects and computer graphics, and sure, in the right hands, they can elevate a story, take something good and turn it into something great, but in the wrong ones, you kind of just get the blue people group too. Ironically, they're the same hands. Even high-level, well-respected filmmakers can become smitten by technology and completely lose sight of the fact that the entire point of trying to make a film is to tell a good story, not to show off fancy new technologies or techniques. It's all gotta be in service to a story. AI is just a tool. It can't make a film for you. You still gotta figure out how to put it all together and translate the unique vision in your head into something people might actually want to watch and enjoy. Otherwise, it's not filmmaking, it's just prompting. The second reason: using this tech and thinking about it every day for the better part of a year now, I believe AI video and AI filmmaking will largely be driven by performances for the foreseeable future, making it pretty much just an extension of existing techniques like motion capture and green screen.
I know you tried, but
you wonder if I could have done more. So do I.
Driving videos, open post, dense post, depth maps, normal maps, latent spaces, buzzword salad, but essentially all the same techniques that film and animation have been using forever. Capturing a performance. And even if that just means you and me getting all Andy Serkis alone in our room, that's still something, right? There's still a human element involved. And that's the thing that's always going to be hard for AI to replicate.
Future world ruled by deadly machines.
Why would you want it to? I know a lot of the focus right now is on ElevenLabs and Runway and purely generative AI, but I think it's the wrong approach. You can generate a bunch of random, loosely related clips and slap them all together, but it's always going to look like shit. And it might be enough to keep some people interested for the first couple years while this tech is novel, but eventually everyone else is just going to get bored of the generated AI look. There's a world of difference between generating a single shot and making an entire film with consistent characters, settings, and dialogue. It's a bigger problem than I think a lot of people realize. Although these AI generators can be useful for certain things, backgrounds, matte, simple shots, if you're trying to make a film with artistic intent, the way they've been doing it for over 100 years, and they're basically useless by themselves. Or take Sad Talker, Wave to Lip, or DID. I look at these things and I wonder, try to figure out what the hell exactly is the point. Sometimes it feels like our tech bro overlords want to digitally simulate everything, even the mundane. Then on the other hand, you have your doomsayers and your Luddites screaming about the world ending in 5 months because AI is coming to take all the crappy call center jobs. But guys, come on. The human element, self-expression, these things are always going to be a fundamental part of art. In fact, I think that's pretty much the entire point. If you can take your face, emote, capture it, and transfer that onto an image or video, even if you're the world's worst actor, you're probably still going to get more subtlety out of that than what an AI can do right now. I'm not saying AI won't ever get there, or that completely generated AI actors won't have their own personalities, mannerisms, and idiosyncrasies someday, but it's just not where we're at right now. I know a lot of people get down on themselves and their abilities, and so using AI, even if it's just as a voice for your faceless YouTube channel, becomes incredibly appealing, but you know you can always practice. You can get better at acting, emoting, making films. You can't change your voice or your face, but so what? I don't see the point in putting yourself out there trying to get your unique perspective out into the world if you're just going to completely hide behind technology. It's not meant to be a replacement for you. It's meant to augment what you can do. And isn't that the point of life? To grow, expand our knowledge, get better at things, rise to challenges. Do you really want to live in a world where human contribution is relegated to the subtle manipulation of advanced technology? Because I sure as hell don't. So if it's the year 2025 and this video is somehow still alive but outdated as the Catholic Counter-Reformation, maybe skip around on the parts about cinematography or filmmaking, but just don't close it. There's plenty of good stuff here, and I worked hard on it. Assholes. We're going to go through the entire filmmaking process step by step and see where AI applies and how it can be useful. Now, the very first thing you gotta do is write a good story, and this is something that I think a lot of new and even old filmmakers completely ignore to their own detriment.
本当に映画作りたいんだったら、その脚本を書きなさいと。で脚本だったらわらばんしと鉛筆があれば書けるんだ。ね？で本当に映画のなんていうの骨格なりね、映画っていうのはどういうものかっていうのを具体的につかむのを脚本リードする以外にないんだ。
Even people I like and respect, certain YouTubers for example, I don't think their not so well received films were ever really there on the page to begin with, and so you can spend years of your life making something that was never going to be great because you never nailed it down in the scripting stage. Even in Hollywood, how many films do you see these days where the movie itself is technically flawless, well directed, but the story is a lumbering, incoherent piece of shit? Well, that's because they wrote the script in a weekend based on a treatment made around a pre-existing IP. It got signed off on by producers and business people, guns were hired, and not once during this entire process did anyone stop to think about whether or not the story was actually worth telling. So, here's a brief synopsis of a film with a well-written story. An old P.T. Barnum man wants to build a dinosaur amusement theme park using advanced cloning technology. The insurance company needs to sign off on it, so invites some paleontologists or whatever to preview the park, and his grandkids are also there. Newman from Seinfeld wants to steal some embryos to sell on the black market because he's underpaid or thinks he is, and Bing, the park's head programmer, deactivates the park security systems during a tropical storm, which leads to a cascade of failures, ultimately culminating in an entertaining survivalist scenario that pits man against prehistoric beast. Everything makes sense. The characters all have clear motivations, there's a plot, and not to dismiss Steven Spielberg, John Williams, the actors, or the crew, but 98% of the movie was there on the page, and so all they really had to do was build off of that. Now here's an example of a poorly written story. Chris Pratt is a dinosaur trainer who leaves a paddock open, fooled by the new Super T-Rex, which can camouflage itself for reasons.
What purpose could we have for a dinosaur that can camouflage?
Cuttlefish genes were added to help her withstand an accelerated growth rate. Cuttlefish have chromatophores that allow the skin to change.
It escapes, I guess.
What the hell? It's in the cage?
Chris...
Wait a second. There are people in there.
That's impossible. It's in the cage! What is happening?
It escapes. It escapes. Chris Pratt and Ron Howard's daughter wander around the park for a while looking for her nephews, yes. Engine is now a paramilitary corporation that wants to turn the dinosaurs into weapons or something.
We're flying.
Or their corporate board does, but not really.
Never imagined. Well, what's you can do this? You did. Bigger. Scarier? Cooler, I believe.
Dr. Wu is evil. Maybe, or he secretly creates weaponized hybrid dinosaurs at the behest of others. Maybe him and Hoskins are secretly working for Biosyn, a rival corporation, but you wouldn't know that until the next movie when they reintroduce it from the novels to try and retcon this one into making more sense.
Anything we've ever
Still don't really know what this movie's about. Even reading backstory articles and wiki pages, I still can't quite figure it out, whereas the first Jurassic Park is pretty straightforward and clear. And that's because one was written by a well-respected science fiction author and the other was written by committee, with ideas sprinkled in by everyone and anyone. Now, Jurassic World might be an entertaining film to some and a box office smash, I'll concede that, but from a storytelling perspective, it's not so great. But this will be one of the big selling points of AI filmmaking. Being able to translate a unique, creative, singular story into something as complex as a film without having to answer to a committee full of studio executives and producer assholes. Which, by the way, is ruining traditional filmmaking. It's kind of the nice thing about a platform like YouTube. Or at least it used to be. One person can make something and we can enjoy it for what it is and was meant to be. So, you know, stories are important. I think they're the main factor when it comes to predicting whether or not people are going to actually watch and like your film. I'd even go so far as to say that if you don't have a good story, maybe you don't even bother trying to make a film, but that's a bit harsh. So if you can't write a good story, maybe collaborate with someone who can so you don't waste your time making something that nobody's going to like. Yeah, I know. They're humans, right? Now this is one of the few actual fun aspects of filmmaking. Even if it's just AI, we still want consistent characters with recognizable features that represent the characters we've written and the people we have in our heads. Now, you can just try to prompt for consistent characters, faces embedded into the checkpoints of whatever you're using, but I don't do that because I want my characters to be unique and I want them to match what I've imagined. I try to only use local tools because I don't want the tools I rely on to disappear or the companies who make them to get too greedy, but I've been handing ArtBreeder money for a while now, so why stop? You might be able to mix faces together with IPAdapter, we'll talk about it later, but then you'd still have to scrape a database of faces together and look how easy and fun this is. I just keep mixing and matching faces until I get the one I want. Ooh, I think we might have found the next Timothée Chalamet. Once you have a character you like, you can generate a few versions of it with different facial expressions, tweaking these sliders, but there's a limit to it, and if you step outside of that, things get weird. But that's okay, we really only need one good photo for the rest of the process.
As far as voices go, do you want to generate your character images and then have people try out for them? Or do you want to use AI? Up to you, But even though things like ElevenLabs sounds pretty great, I think I'm still going to try to work with people as much as I can. There's a lot of good voice talent out there starving for work on sites like Casting Call Club and BTVA.
But you want to get all your dialogue recorded prior to doing the animation. Sometimes, especially with anime, they'll dub the lines in after, but with AI, I think you should have all the lines not only recorded, but roughly edited together. That's going to help pace the animation later on, especially if you're in a one-man band type situation, as a lot of us tend to be. When it comes to animation specifically, and all AI filmmaking is animation to an extent, you're going to need storyboards. Now, on a traditional film, you can go out and shoot lots of coverage, lots of different angles, then get an editor and have them try to cobble all that sweet apple jelly together. But when it comes to animation, we don't have that luxury, and everything kind of needs to be planned out ahead of time. Because we don't want to waste time animating things that aren't even going to make it into the final film, right? Some real-world filmmakers like Bong Joon-ho also meticulously storyboard their films because I guess they don't like wasting time on set. Wes Anderson often makes animatics out of storyboards for the entire movie or key scenes before shooting. Even with films that are less thoroughly storyboarded, the original boards can go a long way towards influencing final design decisions. Either way, we don't want to waste our time animating things that are compositionally weak or that don't use cinematography to properly elevate the story. Storyboards can be detailed sketches, stick figures, or anything in between. I spent a lot of time making full-color storyboards, but that was before I had any intention of animating them. For this whole scene, they were all just quick Photoshop doodles. I just needed to know the basic composition and maybe the camera movements so I could pre-edit the scene with storyboards and know how it's all going to flow together because I edit as I go. It's also important for continuity. For example, in this shot, his elbow starts to come up and then we cut, and in the next shot we continue that movement. This is one way to hide a cut, cutting on motion, but you'd only really be able to do something like that if you planned it early beforehand. Or you can wing it, and then later realize you screwed up and redo things over and over and over again.
Get up, get on up, stay on the scene, get on up.
Once we have our characters cast, then we can start training them into Stable Diffusion, but why train characters in the first place? Well, if you're going to do keyframe animation, it'll allow you to make the keyframes without having to draw them. And even if you're going to use some fancy-ass thing like MagicAnimate or AnimateAnyone, you're still going to need to make the initial images that you feed it. And unless you got a Lamborghini GPU, you're probably going to be limited to a few seconds of animation using these methods anyway. Not to mention easily generating images for back shots, over-the-shoulder shots, and dirty shots. We're basically trying to front-load a lot of our animation and artwork. Training is a good idea. Trust me. We're going to use Stable Diffusion 1.5 because it's really the sweet spot for current generation video cards. It's open source, tested, proven. It just works.
Like a rock.
So the open source stage of AI art and animation is already pretty much dead or dying. With the new Stable Diffusion XL Cheese Dust Turbo or whatever the f they're calling it, they're switching to a licensing model. Civet AI is already starting to put things behind paywalls, but you know what, it's fine. People are probably just going to keep using 1.5 for years. Maybe everyone switches to Stable Diffusion XL once 4090s don't cost as much as a Bugatti, but I like 1.5 just fine. It's just bad for video because that's not what it was trained on. Now, how much time you want to spend training characters is completely up to you, but I went full bore and made what are essentially character sheets for training models in DreamBooth. With the newer models like MagicAnimate and AnimateAnyone, I can see maybe getting away with just training faces and using prompting for the clothing and bodies and stuff. But I had pretty specific outfits that I wanted my characters to have, so this is what I did, but let's start with training the faces. Of course, if you have costumes, friends, and family, and they're willing to be in your animated AI films, you could just take pictures of them from different angles and save yourself a lot of work, but it's not what I did. So what you can do is take your one photo from ArtBreeder, and then we're going to use thin plate spline to animate it, so we can get different angles, expressions, not necessarily different lighting unless we paint that in, but that's okay. I'm not going to go into an in-depth 20-minute tutorial on thin plate or any of these tools because we'd be here for 9 hours, but I'll put links to proper tutorials in the description. We'll also need real ESR gain with GFP gain to upscale the output because the pre-trained thin plate Vox-Celeb model was trained on 256 by 256 resolution images, and we want at least a 512 square resolution for training in Stable Diffusion. Now, a lot of people say that the GFP GAN upscale kind of makes the faces look waxy, and yeah, it does, but that's actually kind of nice for animation where maybe we don't want the ultra photorealistic look anyway. And if you do want that ultra photorealistic look, maybe you close this video and start learning Unreal 5. You can also upscale in Stable Diffusion, use a tool like Upscaly or whatever. Once we have our upscaled faces, we'll want to change the backgrounds because we're trying to train the AI on the things that we want to be consistent, which is our characters' faces and clothing, not the background. That's also going to help us later when we go to tag our training data. You can use stock images for the backgrounds, you don't have to render them, it's just for training, so who cares? Thin plate can give us a nice front and 3/4 view, but as far as profiles and backs go, it isn't really good at generating that stuff from a forward-looking image because that's not what the model was trained on. Even trying to animate from a side view with it can sometimes be spotty at best. In my last video I mentioned Panohead, maybe using that to get a 3D rotational view to generate some training data, and sometimes, it works pretty well, and other times, even if it properly maps the projection, you get this squishy head shit. But it's still useful. If nothing else, it will give us something to use as a starting point. I played around a bit with a few other generative 3D models like Magic123, and I actually managed to create a low-res model of the Barbarian that I then upscaled to use it as an input for image to image, but it takes forever and the results aren't that great, and I only did it because one of my characters is based off some stock images that I bought a long time ago. At least the body is, so I think Panohead is probably the more valuable resource here if you're going to use anything. Now, these days I just use Stable Diffusion to generate body images instead of using storyboards or stock images, and that's what I did for the other characters, as we'll see. But this stuff didn't exist a few years ago. When it comes to 3D AI generators, there are better models out right now. I just can't run them on my GPU, and that's kind of the problem when it comes to a lot of the advances in AI. You're just not going to be able to run this stuff locally until the next generation of video cards come out or the current top tier ones become affordable. But really, we already have all the tools we need right now. Advances will just make things easier. Panohead itself is difficult to work with. You have to align your image to one of the images it was trained on really well, and then you have to use some kind of segmentation and clean all that up in Photoshop, and it's a whole process. I'm not even sure there are any good tutorials for it anywhere, but it gave me a good starting point. The output is going to look something like the starting image, but not really. For me, it wasn't close enough, and this is where being an artist, or having what they used to call in Dragon Warrior 4, a critical eye comes in. I know that a lot of people who want to make AI films or mess around with this technology aren't necessarily artists, and maybe people not having to be good at art is half the damn point, but it certainly helps.
Hey, guys. I like weird sex, I like bad drugs, I'm a very complicated individual. Bullshit. You like pancakes and waffles and you kiss guys on Molly. You're not the heart of darkness. You're grilled cheese with a sucked dick. Let us clean you up. Well, why don't we just think about it?
But when it comes to filmmaking and animation especially, it's a little bit more than that. Look, not all filmmakers are visual geniuses.
Just draw.
Some are. Some start as painters or photographers, while others have different skills that make them effective directors, like being able to manage crews effectively, schmooze investors and executives, or general slave driving. But animation is a bit different. Traditionally the people who have made animated films have been animators or manga artists or whatever, so you're probably not going to have a director of photography to lean on. You're probably going to have to do most everything yourself. But I think most people can train themselves to become adept at the visual arts because vision is so primary. Certainly more intrinsic than something like language, but language becomes arguably more useful in a societal context where communication becomes more important than spotting lions and tigers, and so I think it tends to subjugate visual acuity in a lot of us, even to the point of something like aphantasia. Some of us were maybe lucky enough to take drawing classes in high school where we learned to see more visually. Maybe some people just have a natural aptitude for it, just like anything else in life, but art, drawing, whatever, it's a skill, and Anyone can learn and develop a skill, it just takes a little bit of time and effort. But if you're interested in animation, then I gotta assume you're at least a little skilled in the visual arts, but maybe not, because AI is gonna have everyone thinking that they're Rembrandt Uberman, but just know that these skills are still important and will remain so for a long time to come, despite what anyone else on the internet says. Once we finish preparing our head training images, we can use those to start building the wide and long shots for our character sheets. Now, there's a million ways to do this. You can use a control net like OpenPose or depth maps to prompt your character in their clothing, but since I needed highly specific outfits to match my pre-existing concept art, I screenshotted a bunch of poses for Magic Poser and made some templates. I then painted over roughly where I wanted the clothing, their colors, shape, etc., and took that into image to image and started generating bodies. I tried to prompt for roughly the body type I wanted. Ladies and gentlemen, television's own Will Patton.
All right.
And of course, you're gonna have to do hundreds of iterations to get close to what you're after, or be really good at prompting. And when you do find something that works, you'll have to make slight adjustments and tweaks, and then go into Photoshop, paint over things a bit, adjust the colors, add shadows, play with the light until you get what you're after, then composite the faces in. It's a lot of work. And I did this for different angles at long, medium, and close-up ranges because I think the way this AI stuff works is that it's always going to try to fit what you prompt into the references it was trained on. For example, if you want a close shot, it's going to base things off the closest matching close-up shot it knows, and if you want a long one, it's going to do the same. And everything in between is going to be some kind of statistical guess or interpolation by the AI. Quick sidebar, Stable Diffusion 1.5 is generally pretty bad when it comes to faces and wide shots. This issue has mostly been solved with Stable Diffusion XL as it has twice the base resolution, but you know, it's going to be hard to use with a $300 or $400 video card as opposed to one of those unjustifiably expensive ones. We're gonna replace the heads anyway, right? And look, even going this route, you don't have to make one image at a time. You can try and do it all in one big sheet with different angles, do it all in one go, but then it becomes a question of time. Do you want to wait minutes or hours for the AI to generate a couple huge sheets, or do you want to be waiting seconds for it to generate smaller ones while you continue to work and then you go back and pick through the ones you like the best? When you're one person, pretty much everything comes down to how well you can multitask. Ideally, you'd have a second computer rendering things so you could continue to work on your first one without lagging all to hell, but you know. Might as well mention that there's this Civet AI textual embedding thing that will create a character sheet for you called Car Turner, and it can work okay for prompting characters, I guess. But things get a little 3D looking and cutesy because guess what most character sheets are, so guess what it's trained on. Even using the in-painting method that's suggested, I still can't really get it to match the input, and that's because whatever you're generating needs to really already be embedded into whatever model checkpoint you're using. It can't take, for example, something from image to image and generate a character sheet from it because it's already got to be in there. Even then, going back and prompting my trained character models, the results kind of work, but they're all a little Pixar. However, there is something that can kind of do what I just described, and it's called IPAdapter. Basically, it reads your input image and transfers a lot of characteristics consistently over using a control net much better than a simple image to image would. When it comes to faces specifically, I'm not going to say it exactly resembles the original input. Hey there, Future Adam here, went back and messed around with IPAdapter more, and turns out that it's super duper useful. There's Face Plus and SDXL models, and once you combine those with the right Clip Vision image encoder model thing, you can get pretty accurate results. This is what all the different models look like. I think the SDXL VidH Face Plus model looks the best, but what you can do, and this is going to get convoluted, so stay with me here, is use the 1.5 Face Plus model, go generate an image using depth map, control net, scale that, feed the latent into the SDXL model, and you know, it starts to look really good. Of course, to do this, you have to make a giant spaghetti monster, but the cool thing about Comfy is that you can just drag a generated image into the window and it will load the entire workflow. So I'll link to this mess I created in the description for anyone who wants to try it. But it kind of does in broad strokes, so for hair, outfits, and things like that, I think it can be incredibly useful, especially for hair, which is a bastard to prompt. But even then, it's still going to miss a lot of the finer details if you have them. Like, it knows this guy's a barbarian wearing armor, but it can't pick out the specific details of that armor. It just broadly knows what armor means. Hey, me again. Not entirely accurate. If we use only the IPAdapter Plus models here, not the face ones, and we can provide a depth map with some guidance, and maybe this is where generating a low-res 3D model came in handy, we can pretty accurately transfer a lot of these details. I would even say the limiting factor here is just how low-res the Magic 123 model was. That being said, if you don't mind the changes it makes to your character, you can use it to make whole sheets, or conceivably use it as a replacement for training your own model. Going back and combining it with the in-painting and depth maps, you know, we can maybe get a little closer than we did before. But again, training characters might not even be necessary, especially if they're going to be wearing generic clothing or you plan on relying on prompting to generate them. But I kind of get the feeling it's going to help you regardless. I wouldn't really recommend complicated outfits, two-tone shirts, or half-naked barbarians because that's just going to make your animation more complicated later on. Although character design is an important part of animation, you can usually pick out a good character just from your silhouette, so this might be one of those things that you have to compromise on when it comes to filmmaking. Which is, of course, one giant f***ing compromise.
She loves to laugh, she loves to sing, she does everything.
After we spent hundreds of hours creating all that training data and recording it just to make a 12-second clip for our YouTube channel, we can finally move on to the process of training our models. So, we have all our photos prepared in a data directory, and we're going to use Stable Diffusion and the DreamBooth extension in Automatic 1111 to train our models. We're going to want to use file words to caption our photos, and this is really important for character outfits and such.
She's my hoe now.
The reason being that you can go ahead and train a model without using file words, and it'll work fine, and you'll be able to generate images that look like the person in your training data, but they probably won't be wearing the same outfits. Even if you then try to go prompt the same outfits back in, whether or not it works is going to be completely random based on the seed you used. Whereas if you do use file words and captioning, take the keywords from that and throw them into your prompts, you'll stand a much better chance of bringing back that original training data. Technically, this is overfitting, which is usually bad, but not in this case. Using file words is pretty easy. We just go to the Train Preprocessor tab, set the input and output directories for our data, click Use Blip for caption, and it will generate keyword files for us in the proper format. We want to then go through all the text files and replace generic terms like man or woman with a token for our character, and also added in descriptions of the clothing for us to bring back later through prompting. You want to create a new model using a Stable Diffusion 1.5 checkpoint. Change the settings to whatever the hell works on your computer and graphics card, then change the instance prompt and the class prompt to use the file words we just created. Check that your data directories are set, and now we can finally train. You might have to download the classification dataset, which is 1,500 images of random people. Training takes about an hour on my 3060. Sometimes the training images are fun to watch, and sometimes they're just boring.
Piece of cake.
Let's switch to this guy. Hey, why not? Sayer's done. Let's test the model. So I'm pretty satisfied with these results. They look like the character we were trying to train, and it maintained a lot of the details of the jacket and clothing and such, but there's one thing I want to point out again and again in this video. It's that AI isn't perfect, you know? Even using the same control net, the same prompt, there are subtle differences between all these rendered faces, and although they all resemble the character, it's up to us to figure out which ones best represent him. And that's where the human eye comes in. Intuition, the sixth sense of being an organic life form with brains suited for this kind of thing. All that being said, even with the limitations, taking the time to train our own characters can still be incredibly useful. We've basically created a little assistant, a friend, an electronic slave, I suppose, who maybe doesn't always exactly understand how you want things done, but they're willing to try and they won't ever give up on you or quit. And hey, that's something to help guide us through the existential loneliness of making a f***ing movie all by ourselves, right? Even if their little electronic peanut brains can't even comprehend the simplest of tasks, it'll still do its best, which is more than I can say for a lot of people, and Not to be misanthropic or nihilistic, I understand that everyone's self-interest pretty much supersedes the self-interests of everyone around them, except for maybe people who have children. And I'll go ahead and include myself in that, but we're talking about technology here, tools, and with a large enough lever, you can move the world or at least turn the dial. I've already gone over the Tokyo jab method of keyframe animation in my previous video, but I've refined my way of working with it using interpolation, hand painting, and ComfyUi batch processing, so I figured we'll go over it again. We start with a video of the performer doing their thing. Now, right off the bat here, I'm going to say, buy a green screen. Green screens are your friend. You might be able to rotoscope the background out manually or with AI or whatever, but it's just so much work to do that. You don't want to be doing extra work for no reason, do ya? I guess I wanted to try to maybe use image to image to transfer some lighting information from the scene, but that doesn't really work that well except for in extreme cases. So once you have your video nicely prepped, you'll want to export the frames and then pick the keyframes, which is a bit of an art form, but basically you don't want any blurry images. These keyframes are going to go in an image grid, and I use Texture Packer for this. Be sure to set the algorithm to basic and the sort to name, otherwise images will get sorted randomly and we'll have a bad time when we go to split the sheet. Now, I was using automatic 4:1s to pre-process and render the images, and it's fine. Make sure you just click Pixel Perfect and don't change the resolution like I did here, but I've moved on to ComfyUi for most rendering and pre-processing tasks as it's faster, more stable, and requires less RAM. I only had 16 keyframes here, but sometimes I have 30 or more, and automatic just can't handle that resolution, especially when you start gridding things and turning them into giant images. Why grid? Consistency when rendering images. If you just batch process a bunch of separate images, even using the same seed, you're never really going to get things all that consistent, and that's why a lot of the effort in the AI art world over the past year or so has gone into trying to make stable, consistent video. We want to take the keyframes from our original video and turn them into control net images, but which control net to use? Well, they all have their advantages and disadvantages. Depth maps are pretty good for everything but hands. Now, technically, OpenPose should be able to ace hands, but there's currently a problem. OpenPose isn't very good. It's not that accurate. DW Pose is much better for image pre-processing, and we can get accurate positionings of fingers and hands and crap. But since the OpenPose ControlNet model we'll still be using was itself trained on OpenPose, rendering still kinda sucks. We can see here that it doesn't really quite follow the original video. Now, hopefully someone somewhere is training a control net on DW Pose. The paper's author says they're interested. This guy wants to do it. Maybe I'll do it myself. Probably not, but if you're watching this in the future, hopefully that work's been done. If not, MagicAnimate, AnimateAnyone, or whatever else comes along might be slightly limited by the OpenPose model, and I'm not sure people realize this yet. So, if not OpenPose is our control net, then that just leaves depth maps and maybe Canny. I usually use depth maps because it's just enough information to be able to diffuse into something else without being too rigid, and I set the strength and comfy at half. Control nets are about finding a balance between the original image and what you're trying to generate. And to an extent, that's the problem with something like Canny because it's hard edge detection, so it's going to be rough to diffuse, for example, a man into a woman. And that's where something like OpenPose would be ideal, but we've already discussed the limitations. Sometimes you're going to want to feed the system more information than a skeleton pose anyway. Sometimes you want to give it a little bit of guidance. So, what's my current workaround for hands? The bane of any AI artist's existence? Well, I think the Stable Diffusion XL model is a little bit better at hands because it's trained at a higher resolution. You can maybe use that, but my hands are similar enough to man's hands, so why not just use them? I brought back the hands from the original video frames and painted them and colored them to match the rest, and this is of course a lot of work, but I think you're always going to have to be going back and either correcting things the AI does or spending a lot of time preparing the things you feed into it. And that's fine, it's work, dumb work. Sometimes it's nice to do dumb time wasting work. People have been doing dumb work for thousands of years. But it's up to each of us to figure out how much time we want to actually waste on fine details. Detail that might not even make it into the final product in order to get things right. But I'm open to replacements for dumb labor, and that's really what using AI is all about. I mean, if you're similar enough to your character's build, you've got the right clothing, why animate at all? Why not just stylize it and edit it to fit in with the rest of your animations? Will anyone notice? Will anyone care? Of course, most of the time you will have to animate using some kind of method, and maybe we're still stuck in early 2024 in the salad days of animation, and so maybe right now our options are limited. One last quick tip. If you upscale your source image and then pull a higher resolution depth map from that, you can get slightly more accurate hands. It's still not perfect, but it's a bit closer to being something we can fix ourselves without having to do a ton of extra work. So, once you're done rendering and processing your sheet, you split it, take your keyframes, run them through EbSynth, EbSynth, I've been saying it wrong I guess, drag them into DaVinci or Premiere or whatever, and you're left with the blendy weird animation because the patterns in your character's clothing are just a bit too complex for EbSynth. But there's ways to clean that weirdness up, they just require a lot of effort. Maybe you start by taking the good keyframes, going in and hand animating mats to clean it all up a bit. Maybe when you're done doing that, you bounce it down and it looks okay, better, but there are still issues, so maybe you go download a few frame interpolation libraries like Film or Rife to do some A/B testing for the kiddos. And by the way, I think Film looks a little bit better, but you be the judge. But of course, you don't want to just use those interpolated frames because that looks weird. You want to go mask it off, usually around edges and things like that. And if things are really Captain Brannigan, either Revelation Space or Futurama, take your pick. You can go in and manually paint some of the keyframes yourself. Eventually, through this long process, you'll get smooth animation. At least for the body, and that just leaves the head and thin plate, but let's talk about this first. Let's go through some of the EbSynth Keyframe Animation Alternatives that are out there right now, because admittedly we're kind of just doing actual animation here, and I know that's not really the promise of AI. And even if these tools become obsolete, development ceases, or they just plain suck, I still want to talk about them briefly to hopefully save someone somewhere the time of trying them out. So I thought TokenFlow looked pretty promising. Stylize a video with the prompt and make it highly consistent. Yes, that's what we want. I still haven't bothered to properly learn Python, but I went in there and hacked around and added my own diffusion model to it to see what it could do. If I remember, I couldn't get it to use the depth map option because it's the weird Stable Diffusion 2.0 version of that or something. Anyway, I ended up with this horror show, which isn't surprising given the dissimilarities between the driving video and my init image. So then I went to pre-process my own driving video, and that takes 40 minutes and turns the video sideways. And then I guess it can't figure out how to do its thing once the video's sideways, so I just gave up on it. Maybe I'll go back and play around with it some more, but realistically, I'm probably not going to sit around and wait an hour for 4 seconds of animation to finish processing. But then like a week later, MagicAnimate came out, and I was a little surprised by this because AnimateAnyone had everyone frothing at the mouth, and then this came out ahead of that, and it does basically the same thing, kinda. It just does it with some weird dense pose thing that I guess people aren't super stoked on, but it's fine. You can just download this GitHub library and process your own videos into a dense pose. Just make sure your target image is 24 bits, and my god, look at those mitts! Ooh, wow. You can actually get this working with OpenPose if you go into this director and replace the dense pose control net model with the OpenPose one. And it's pretty good. The hands still aren't perfect, but it's closer than anything else I've seen, and I'd rather work around cleaning this up over, for example, the EbSynth process, but unfortunately the sleeves went all screwy, so in the end I just composited the DW pose version over the dense pose version, and it looks pretty good. Hey yo! Now, the main disadvantage right now is that I can only render about 4 seconds of video before MagicAnimate runs out of RAM, so we'll probably have to do something like take the last frame from the video, generate a new clean frame using our trained model, use that to make another video, and then blend between the two. Yeah, training characters was maybe worth it all along, huh? Now, as far as AnimateAnyone goes, maybe it's out by now, but in here it's been over 2 months and they still haven't released the code for it on GitHub, which, you know, realistically it should take like an afternoon to write some console commands. It's been so long that other people have come along and written their own versions of it, taking the math or whatever from the paper, and you know, they're okay. Just generally speaking, it's pretty weird to release teaser trailers for a GitHub project, but this was Alibaba Group, so. AnimateDiff has come a long way in the past few months. AnimateDiff Evolved happened, which implements a sliding context window which enables you to generate animations of theoretically any length, and prompting it is pretty fun. But I'm still hesitant to use it for character animation with control nets and such because the sliding context window means that it will still change temporally a bit every 16 frames or so. However, I've still found uses for it, like building the city animation by taking some video from Google Earth, loading up a city lore from Civid AI, and then I started generating Neo Tokyos. Because what other city could it possibly be? I went into Photoshop, composited the exact look I was after, and after that I started doing the real work of animating. And I don't want to get into editing and compositing just yet, but when it comes to filmmaking, even with animation, a lot of selling the visuals really comes down to how you edit and composite. Extra little effects you add and the extra little touches and flourishes. Which is why I kinda hate the idea of getting Runway or Peak or whatever to build everything in your shots for you. It's always gonna look like AI when you do that, and although we are using AI to make films here, you don't actually want your films to look like AI, do ya? Now of course they can still be useful tools, but the way I'm gonna likely end up using something like Runway is to do animation on background objects. For example, it would be nice to add some motion to this background window here. And you can do that in Runway. It might take a few tries, but you can do it, it's fine. But already, I don't really like these AI companies, man. I don't like the subscription model. I mean, I paid you for a couple months, I still have credits left, but you're still gonna slap your watermark over everything I generate? It's just greedy. Now, I understand companies need to make money, but add an option for me to purchase tokens or seconds or implement a better credit system, and maybe I'll give you more of my money, because turning everything in the world into a subscription service where you rent time is just so greasy. You're also greasy. And it's not just Runway, it's all of them. ElevenLabs, your credits don't roll over, so if you don't use what they give you every month, you're basically just handing them over free money, those greedy And you can't really use something like AnimateDiff to do this work because it can't really go off an image except for vaguely. There's also video stable diffusion now, but you can't condition it with text at the moment, so its use is somewhat limited. Although it can sometimes still produce interesting results. But all this generative AI is limited anyway, man. You can't go beyond 4 seconds or 6 seconds, and if you do, then temporal consistency just goes into the toilet. Till they can address the issue of temporal consistency, I'm just not sure how useful generative video is actually going to be, so I guess I'll be in the motion transfer camp for a while. Now, there are a couple other things worth mentioning. Temporal Kit, which basically does the EbSynth Tokyo Jab thing for you, but using a tile control net, so it's only really suitable for doing a style transfer, and along the same lines, Temporal Net, which I couldn't really get to be as temporally consistent as I would have liked. Let's talk about thin plate, spline, and compositing and working with heads a bit. Now, if you look at most of the techniques that we've used so far, whether that be keyframing and stable diffusion, MagicAnimate, AnimateAnyone, or whatever, they're all pretty good at general motion and body movement, but bad at lip syncing and head movements, and that's because heads are complex, much in the same way that hands are complex. And so things will go a lot smoother for us if we use something trained specifically on heads. And I like thin plate, I like the pre-trained Vox Celeb checkpoint. It's low resolution, but we can upscale as previously discussed. And most of the time it works fine when you've recorded someone's head from a specific perspective, but if there's a lot of turning and twisting, then you'll often have to go back and fix all of that. Because you gotta remember, All the AI is really doing is filling in information given a certain set of data points, and it can be trained to do that well, but we're in the early days of this stuff, folks, so this is what we have for now.
Understood.
My tips for ThinPlate are as follows. Get a nice alignment image going. Another advantage to having trained our own character models is that we can take a still frame from our driving video and use it to generate our init image, and it will be perfectly aligned. Try to keep the driving video from moving too much. There's a certain limit to how far the head can move before the AI can no longer map it. Do all your work in a lower resolution space and then upscale. If you have a lot of stuff that needs fixing, it's going to be much easier to fix at a lower resolution, faster too. As far as compositing itself goes, it's a bit of an art form, but masks and nodes and DaVinci Resolve are pretty good at this kind of thing. Once the animation is in there, I'm often masking off dark and light parts, adding shadows by duplicating, and applying all kinds of tricks to try and sell the image. Sometimes I'm even using masks to shape light in the editor, which is another huge time suck, which brings us to our next topic. Even though we're using AI and computers, there'll still be many times where you'll have to go in and fix things or adjust things by hand. For example, here's the original version of this opening shot, and here's what it eventually became, and it's a long road to do something like this. Runway gave me the basic animation, but it's rough, not something I can use in my project by itself, but we can use it as a guide. First thing I did was inpainting, which I haven't really talked about much, but since I was animating this from a pre-existing storyboard, the background wasn't already matted onto its own layer. Again, I never planned on animating any of this. AI just kinda happened and started to make it all possible. Using the Runway animation as a guide, I went back and hand painted over most of the keyframes to get it looking, not like hot milky garbage. And then I used frame interpolation with film to do some in-between frames, and then went back and painted over those, and it was a process. Some might say we're doing actual animation here. But eventually I ended up with something that had a bit more quality in it than what I started with. And I've gone back and fixed other shots as the technology has continued to develop. Some of it still looks wonky when you slow it down, so I'll have to go back and paint over those frames and clean them up, or maybe not. They say perfection is the enemy of good. Of course, the technology is always going to get better, but hopefully if you're starting from scratch, you can plan some of this stuff better than I did, because adapting pre-existing art into animation is a bit rough. Then you have things like light and shadow, which can be very difficult to prompt with something like Stable Diffusion. I mean, think about it. If all these AIs are trained on photo caption data, there's just not a lot of photos out there with captions like strong key light coming from the left, strong backlight, rim light coming from the right, or even just a simple light from the left. Because lighting is a highly technical thing and not something your average person is going to go out of their way to caption. There's ways to force the AI into the ballpark, but it's just not something that's super controllable right now, but I'm fine with that. Most of the time I'd rather go in and paint light and shadows in by hand anyway, just so I can get exactly the look I'm after, and really, this is the only way to get things looking 100% consistent anyway. Again, it's all about having that critical eye and being able to take a bunch of independent parts and slap them all together, because that's what filmmaking really is. I truly believe that no matter how good AI gets, it's always just going to be your starting point when it comes to film and animation. But does consistent lighting even really matter? Even on real films, real shows, the lighting is never 100% consistent, and nobody really notices unless you start getting obsessed with cinematography. Even on quality productions where they know what they're doing, they will often tweak the lighting setup slightly between shots for obvious reasons. But for animation, I like to stick with motivated lighting. This is where the light in your scene is motivated by objects like doors and windows, and of course you can cheat it a bit, because you can always cheat, but either way I think it's best to have an overall plan of how the lighting is going to work. If you really want to get advanced, some knowledge of how you would actually light a scene in traditional film might be helpful, but it's not strictly necessary. Of course, we can do whatever we want in animation as long as it looks good, but if you're specifically trying to emulate the look of film like I am, then some rudimentary lighting knowledge might be useful. Now, if we are trying to emulate film, then it might be useful to know about lenses, camera movements, all that kind of stuff. And even if we're not trying to mimic movies, animation tends to borrow a lot of technique from film anyway, especially if we're talking about things like anime and Disney. I'll make a proper video on focal lengths when I get enough interesting shots, but for now, for animation, I think we mostly just have to pay attention to depth of field. Depth of field is a consequence of focal length, aperture, and distance to the subject, but for now, with all other things being equal, we should just notice that, generally, the longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. And since close-ups tend to be shot on longer focal lengths, this means that the closer the subject is in our frame, the more shallow the depth of field should probably be. Even wider lenses, if you get close enough, you'll still have a shallow depth of field from close focusing. You'll just get more perspective distortion from having to be closer to the subject. Perspective distortion is another important aspect of filmmaking, another tool in our box, but I'm just not sure how well it translates to AI animation. Let's try some tests with control nets. You also have other considerations like lens flares, veiling glare, film grain, and all the other different ways you can texture an image. As far as flares go, we should also maybe notice that the longer the focal length, the larger and less distinguished the flares, until you get to a long enough one where they cease being shapes anymore and just become sort of dancing, flashing light. When it comes to background, static ones can be fine, but animation utilizes a multi-plane camera, or these days layers, to simulate movement and depth. AI also gives us the option to use things like depth maps, which I used here to make the camera pull out and feel more like an actual dolly shot as opposed to a two-dimensional zoom. Of course, with that I also had to go back, paint over some things, and fix stuff. So a lot of books have been written about cinematography, and a lot of that has to do with lighting, but also composition and framing. When it comes to animation, these things become somewhat indistinguishable, as a lot of it's done through storyboards and previs. So let's go through this scene piece by piece, because the cinematography is a little wonky, but I feel like anything can be fine so long as you can justify what you've done. This whole scene is basically three people standing around and talking in a room, which is, 80% of movies. Here's a silly diagram I drew of it just so we can examine where the camera is, and we can also see where the lighting is coming from, the door and window. The first shot is essentially our establishing shot, and it's a nice long pull-out. I would have liked to get closer with a wider angle to make everything distorted, heightened, and claustrophobic, but we've already talked about the limitations. The next shot is a reverse shot of the first, but not quite. From a proper reverse shot from Mia, we'd likely place the camera Mia, and it would look something like this to preserve our already established action line. But we're not going to do that for reasons that will soon become apparent. Going into the next shot, we have the eye line looking right, and in the reverse from that, we should try not to break the 180-degree rule and put the camera here so as to maintain the same eye line, but again, we'll go ahead and walk across that line. Incidentally, this shot was originally a bit wider to match the sandwiching shots, but I cropped in a bit as to make this character feel slightly more imposing. Well, what's going on here? That's twice now I've stepped over the action line and broken the 180-degree rule. Does it even make sense? Well, I would say yeah, I've carried the action over in between shots, and it might be slightly disorienting at first, but that's okay because sometimes you want things to be slightly disorienting. Of course, you can play it safe, never cross an action line, have 3 identical over-the-shoulder shots for 3 different characters. I mean, it's kind of boring, but you can do it. Or even 2 identical push-ins back-to-back when the characters are sitting right next to each other, because who needs a 2-shot? Who needs 2 characters in 1 frame? That would be crazy. Or maybe you occasionally cross that line because you trust that your audience isn't made up of brain-dead toddlers that can't figure out when a camera is moved to the opposite side of a table. But guys, Oppie is talking in a hallway. I don't understand these eye lines. The camera's moving over the action line like a ping pong ball. I'm gonna make a post in the cinematography subreddit about whether or not Christopher Nolan broke the 180-degree rule, but oh no, Kubrick's doing it here, and we all know he was a hack, right? The next shot we've seen, and then some reaction shots. We've also matched movement here, which is sometimes hard to plan doing a film, but we really have no excuse in animation if we want things to flow and look smooth. And then we finally get to this shot, and suddenly everything makes sense, right? In context, we can see that this shot is really just a crop in from here. And after a reaction close-up, we'll punch into this shot, where we'll do a slow dolly push to emphasize what the character's saying, followed by one more subtle dolly push. But this time the point is to disconnect our main character from the other two, and that's basically it. The point is, cinematography rules aren't like hard rules, they're just guides to help us so we don't accidentally confuse our audience. You should learn them and know why they're used, but don't be afraid to break them from time to time if that's what the scene needs. This wasn't super complicated cinematography. I dare say this YouTube video was more complex, but I wanted to go through it to emphasize the point that filmmaking, animation especially, just takes a lot of planning. As in, I don't think you can really wing something like this, but more importantly, as AI starts to take more and more of the grunt work out of film and animation, other things like your ability to plan a scene are going to start to become more important than technical ability. We can just go out right now and generate a bunch of random shit, or even things that kind of go together, and try to edit them together into a cohesive whole, but a film does not that make. You want to try to emulate the look of film like I did, more traditional animation, or perhaps something like anime. I spent a lot of time trying to texture my images so it wouldn't just look like cardboard cutouts standing in front of a background, adding noise and flares and all the other things that AI can't really do. At least not yet. Maybe you want to go crazy with it. Maybe you want to come up with your own unique styles and textures that no one's ever seen before, and that's probably smart because then you'll have your own visual signature. So much of art and animation is all about iconic signatures, and someone's gonna do it. Someone's gonna become the 21st century AI visual storytelling master Rembrandt and make, if not great films, at least ones that get popular and maybe over time become well respected. And I could do it. I'll try. I've got more stories than I possibly will ever have time to animate, but I'm getting older. I wish I was 10 to 15 years younger. And that's part of why I made this video, because you kids today, you chitlins, you got the world at your fingertips. Whereas mine was more of a transitional generation of crappy Nintendo graphics, dial-up internet, and software rendered computer games. Whereas you teens today, you can do almost anything, and it's only gonna get easier. So I hope some of you takes this stuff and runs with it. Shows the world what yous can do, and of course some of you will. Because the older generations, it's not so much that we're scared of technology, it's that we sometimes just don't have the time. Or we have a lifetime's worth of responsibilities. Whereas when you're young, if you've got nothing else, you've got time. And if you're older like me or even older, who knows, maybe I look young to you, and farting around with this stuff's still pretty fun, right? And if making a film's really what you want to do, then go ahead and do it. Who cares if it makes no sense financially or career-wise? Sometimes you gotta do things just to say that you did it. Just to let the goddamn world know that you existed for a brief flicker of time. And this here video, it's what I decided to do with my time. At least for a while. Hope you liked it, assholes. You're still here? Go home, the video's over. Ah, I forgot to talk about Sora. Well, I would say it looks pretty...